The underwater city of Veridia shimmered, a colossal structure of bioluminescent coral and shimmering plasteel. Here lived the Glargons, a species as disciplined and rigid as the ocean currents were unpredictable. Their society was a hierarchy of military precision, every aspect of life governed by protocol and tradition. Today, Veridia was cloaked in a somber, pulsating blue light. The occasion was the Grand Mourning, the funeral of Grand Admiral Krill, a leader revered for his strategic brilliance and unwavering commitment to the Glargon Imperium. The Grand Admiral's passing was not merely a loss, it was a tear in the very fabric of their society, a disruption that demanded the utmost solemnity. Glargon citizens, clad in their navy blue ceremonial armor, moved with a synchronized grace that was both mesmerizing and slightly unnerving. Each movement, each ripple of their gills was a precise execution of ancient customs. Their mournful chants echoed through the water, a symphony of grief perfectly orchestrated. At the heart of the city, within the grand cenotaph, lay the admiral's shell preserved in a crystal sarcophagus. The cenotaph was a vast open chamber, its walls adorned with holographic projections of Krill's greatest victories, each one a testament to Glargon might. This was a place of deep respect, where even the most junior cadet knew to hold their breath a moment longer, to minimize any disturbance. But amidst this display of profound, structured grief, there was an anomaly, a splash of the unexpected, a ripple in the otherwise perfectly still waters of Glargon custom. He was an observer, as out of place as kelp in a desert, a human named Dave. Dave wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't invited, and he certainly wasn't dressed for the occasion. Clad in faded jeans and a t-shirt that read, "I need more space," he stood awkwardly at the edge of the crowd, a bemused expression on his face. How he managed to get past Glargon security was a mystery, but here he was, a lone human adrift in a sea of aquatic militarism. The ceremony droned on, a seemingly endless procession of speeches, hymns, and ritualistic gestures. Dave, initially intrigued by the sheer alienness of it all, quickly began to lose interest. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, stifling a yawn that threatened to crack the solemn silence. "So," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough to be picked up by a nearby Glargon guard's sensitive auditory organs. "How long before they serve the little cocktail shrimp?" Captain Zorp, a Glargon officer distinguished by his particularly sharp mandibles and an array of medals glinting on his chest, turned his multifaceted eyes towards the human. Zorp was a creature of logic, a soldier who believed in order and discipline. This human was an affront to everything he held sacred. Dave, oblivious to the growing Glargon ire, continued his quiet commentary. "You know, for a species that lives underwater, they sure are dry," he whispered, scratching his head. "Bet the old admiral would have wanted a party, not this." He punctuated the last word with a dismissive wave of his hand. Zorp's pectoral fins flared slightly, a sign of rising agitation. He nudged the Glargon guard beside him. "Observe this." "Dave," he hissed, his voice a low, guttural rumble. "His behavior is illogical. Note any further deviations from acceptable mourning protocols." The guard, a young recruit named FLRP, nodded nervously, his own gills fluttering in response to Zorp's displeasure. Dave, now seemingly bored with the ceremony, began to fidget. He pulled out a small metallic object from his pocket and started clicking it rhythmically. Click, click, click. The sound, amplified by the water, echoed through the cenotaph like a tiny, annoying hammer against a titanium hull. Zorp's eye twitched. "What is that infernal device?" Zorp growled, his patience wearing thin. FLRP, unsure, consulted his datapad. "Preliminary analysis indicates a clicker, Captain. Human recreational device, used for distracting oneself." Zorp stared at the datapad, then back at Dave, who was now attempting to balance the clicker on his nose. The captain swam closer, his armored form looming over the human. "Human," he said, his voice dripping with thinly veiled hostility. "This is a place of mourning. Show some respect." Dave, startled, nearly swallowed the clicker. He fumbled with it for a moment before managing to pocket it with a sheepish grin. Right, sorry, Captain, he said, his tone laced with sarcasm that was completely lost on Zorp. Wouldn't want to ruin the ambiance. Emboldened by what he perceived as a successful attempt at diplomacy, Dave decided to take his show of respect to the next level. He remembered reading something about offering a token of remembrance at funerals, a gesture of goodwill toward the departed. Reaching into his waterproof satchel, he produced a small metal flask. Excuse me, folks, Dave announced, his voice echoing slightly in the water-filled space. I'd like to, offer a toast to the Admiral. A little something to, send him off with a bang. He held up the flask for all to see. The Glargons, initially confused, watched with mounting suspicion. Inside the flask wasn't some precious human artifact or a symbol of mourning. It was something far more terrestrial. Dave had filled it with a home-brewed concoction he affectionately called Seaweed Surprise, a fermented mix of various sea plants he'd found on a nearby, mostly deserted oceanic planet. He thought it would be a fitting tribute, a sort of, aquatic refreshment for an aquatic admiral. It's, fermented seaweed, Dave explained helpfully, unscrewing the top of the flask. My own recipe. Thought it'd be appropriate. The Glargons exchanged horrified glances. Fermented seaweed to them was less a beverage and more a biological hazard. It was the stuff that clogged filtration systems, the reason for many submarine malfunctions. Zorp's eye twitched. Again. Human, he said, his voice dangerously low. What is the meaning of this? Dave, blissfully unaware of the offense he was causing, beamed. It's a drink. For the Admiral. A little seaweed cheer. Anyone want a sip? He extended the flask towards the nearest Glargon, a gesture that was met with a chorus of recoiled bodies and wide, frightened eyes. The atmosphere in the cenotaph shifted from solemn to, something akin to horrified bewilderment. The Glargons, a species known for their rigid adherence to protocol, were completely unprepared for this level of bizarre generosity. Dave, meanwhile, stood there, flask in hand, a picture of well-meaning but utterly misplaced enthusiasm. It was clear that this funeral was about to get a lot more interesting, or, from Zorp's perspective, a lot more problematic. Captain Zorp, his bioluminescent patterns flashing with a mixture of anger and confusion, knew he couldn't let this seaweed surprise incident slide. This human was either incredibly ignorant or unbelievably audacious, and Zorp wasn't sure which was worse. Protocol demanded a full investigation. He barked orders to his second-in-command, a nervous Glargon named Gleep, to secure Dave's belongings and initiate a thorough analysis of his behavior. Gleep, his fins trembling slightly, scurried to obey. Dave, still oblivious to the gravity of the situation, was gently but firmly escorted to a holding cell, a small sterile chamber usually reserved for captured pirates or malfunctioning drones. His satchel was confiscated, and every item within was catalogued with meticulous detail. Zorp watched from the observation room, his three eyes narrowed in suspicion. The contents of Dave's satchel were perplexing. There was a strange rectangular device with a cracked screen, apparently some kind of data storage unit. There were also several small, colorful cloths, folded haphazardly, and a collection of odd metallic tools with no discernible purpose. Zorp consulted the Glargon database, but none of the items matched any known technology or artifact. But what truly baffled Zorp was a small, leather-bound book filled with strange symbols and diagrams. It looked ancient, primitive, and utterly useless. Zorp activated the translation matrix, hoping to decipher the symbols, but the device sputtered and emitted a series of error messages. It seemed human language was even more chaotic and illogical than their behavior. Zorp shifted his focus to Dave himself, ordering Gleep to compile a psychological profile based on his observations. The report came back fragmented and contradictory. Dave exhibited signs of both high intelligence and profound stupidity. He seemed genuinely concerned about offending the Glargons, yet his actions consistently undermined his intentions. He was an enigma wrapped in a waterproof jumpsuit. As Zorp delved deeper into the investigation, He became increasingly convinced that Dave was not just a harmless tourist. He was a spy, a saboteur, or perhaps even a weapon. His strange belongings, his bizarre behavior, his seaweed surprise, it all pointed to a sinister plot. But what was his objective? What was he planning to do with the Glargon High Council? Zorp knew he had to find out before it was too late. The fate of the Glargon civilization might depend on it. Zorp, now utterly consumed by suspicion, turned his attention back to the flask. The unsettling liquid inside seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, reflecting the dim light of the lab in an unsettling way. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, a cold dread that only came when facing imminent existential threat. This was no ordinary beverage. It was a weapon, cleverly disguised. He ordered a full spectral analysis of the flask's contents, rerouting power from the city's filtration system to maximize the sensitivity of the sensors. Technicians scrambled, muttering about energy conservation protocols, but Zorp silenced them with a glare. This was a matter of paramount importance. The readings that flickered across the screen were unusual. The liquid contained a complex array of organic compounds, some of which were completely unknown to Glargon science. There were traces of fermented sugars, exotic herbs, and a potent neurotoxin that, while present in small quantities, could have devastating effects on Glargon physiology if properly weaponized. Zorp felt a surge of vindication. His instincts were correct. This human was indeed a threat. With the evidence in hand, Zorp stormed into the chambers of the Glargon High Council, his bioluminescent patterns blazing with righteous fury. The council, a collection of ancient and revered Glargons, were gathered in their customary circle, their wrinkled faces etched with concern. He presented his findings, laying out the evidence with methodical precision, culminating with the analysis of the weaponized seaweed. This flask, Zorp boomed, his voice echoing through the chamber, contains a substance designed to poison our waters, to destabilize our minds, to cripple our civilization. The council members gasped, their eyes widening in horror. Some began to murmur prayers to the Great Filter, a cosmic entity believed to protect the Glargons from extinction. The human, Dave, Zorp continued, is not merely a tourist. He is an agent of chaos, a harbinger of destruction. He must be apprehended immediately, before he can unleash his deadly concoction upon our unsuspecting populace. The council, their faces grim, deliberated for a moment. Then, the Grand Elder, his voice raspy with age, spoke. Captain Zorp, you are hereby authorized to apprehend the human and bring him before us for judgment. Let the full might of the Glargon military be brought to bear if necessary. Our survival depends on it. But before the heavily armored Glargon guards could descend upon him, Dave held up a hand, his expression surprisingly calm. Whoa, hold on a sec, guys, he said, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. There's been a slight misunderstanding. He gestured to the flask. This isn't some kind of doomsday device. It's whiskey. The Glargons exchanged confused glances. Whiskey? The word was alien to their language, their culture, their entire aquatic existence. Captain Zorp, his bioluminescence flickering with disbelief, scoffed. Whiskey? What is this whiskey? Some kind of human code for biological warfare? Dave sighed, the sound bubbling through the water. No, whiskey it's a drink, something humans consume for, well, lots of reasons. Sometimes to celebrate, sometimes to forget, and, yeah, sometimes to mourn. He paused, trying to find the right words. It's kind of a comfort thing. He continued. And this isn't just any whiskey. It's an Islay single malt aged 18 years. Top shelf stuff. Back on Earth we have this tradition, see? When someone dies, you raise a toast to them. You say a few words, share a memory, and then you offer a little bit of your drink to the deceased. A symbolic gesture, like a final send-off. Dave carefully uncorked the flask. The scent of peat and oak wafted through the water. a bizarre anomaly in the normally sterile environment of the Glargon city. He tilted the flask, allowing a small stream of the amber liquid to flow into the surrounding water. The effect was immediate. Microscopic particles of the whiskey dispersed, creating a faint swirling discoloration that was instantly picked up by the Glargon's sophisticated sensor network. Alarms didn't blare, but the subtle shift in water composition triggered a flurry of activity in the control rooms. Within moments, a team of Glargon scientists were analyzing the substance. Their instruments whirred and clicked, processing data at an astonishing rate. Captain Zorp watched with bated breath, his mandibles twitching nervously. He expected a devastating report, confirmation of a deadly toxin or some other insidious weapon. The results, however, were perplexing. The lead scientist, her antennae drooping in confusion, turned to Zorp. "Captain," she reported, her voice a synthesized monotone, "the substance, it is remarkably benign." Zorp's bioluminescence flickered again, this time with utter bewilderment. "Benign? You mean it's not harmful?" The scientist shook her head. "On the contrary, Captain. Initial analysis suggests it is potable. And," she hesitated, "it possesses a rather peculiar taste." The news rippled through the assembled Glargons like a shockwave. Potable? Something deliberately made for consumption? The very concept was alien to their rigorously controlled, nutrient paste-based diet. The initial horror began to morph into something akin to curiosity. Could it be that this human was not attempting an act of aggression, but rather a bizarre, almost incomprehensible gesture of respect? The idea was so far outside their cultural framework that it seemed ludicrous, yet the scientific evidence was undeniable. The liquid posed no threat. It was, in its own strange way, intended for ingestion. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Glargons exchanged confused glances, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with uncertainty. They had prepared for battle, for a desperate defense against an unknown weapon. Instead, they were faced with something far more baffling, an alien custom. The High Council, their multifaceted eyes gleaming with a mixture of apprehension and intrigue, conferred in hushed tones. They reviewed the sensor data, the scientific reports, and the translated fragments of Dave's earlier pronouncements. The evidence suggested that the humans' intentions, however strange, were not malicious. A few of the braver, or perhaps more foolish, Glargons edged closer to the affected area, drawn by an irresistible impulse. Tentatively, they extended a sensory appendage, drawing a minute amount of the diluted whiskey into their taste receptors. The initial reaction was universally one of surprise. The taste was unlike anything they had ever experienced. A complex blend of smoky, sweet, and slightly bitter notes that danced across their palates. Some recoiled in disgust, while others exhibited a flicker of appreciation. Even Captain Zorp, despite his deep-seated suspicion, found himself strangely intrigued. He watched as a younger Glargon, barely an adult, tentatively sampled the diluted whiskey, her bioluminescence shifting from a cautious blue to a slightly brighter, more inquisitive green. Perhaps, he thought, there was more to this human and his strange customs than he had initially assumed. A hush fell over the assembly as the Grand Admiral's son, a figure as imposing as his father had been, swam forward. His bioluminescent patterns, normally a rigid military blue, flickered with an unreadable emotion. He approached the spot where Dave had poured the whiskey, the faint discoloration still visible in the water. He extended a sensory tendril, drawing a small amount of the liquid towards his mouth. The Glargons held their breath, every eye fixed on the Admiral's air. He hesitated for a moment, then, with a visible gulp, swallowed the strange concoction. His reaction was immediate. He coughed, a deep resonant sound that echoed through the underwater plaza. His bioluminescence flared wildly, shifting through a spectrum of colors that signified extreme distress. It seemed for a moment that Dave's whiskey might have just assassinated the future leader of the Glargon people. Then, slowly, the chaotic display subsided. The Admiral's son took a deep breath, his bioluminescence settling into a calmer, though still unusual, shade of green. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, flickered across his face. "Strange," he said, his voice amplified by the water. "Very strange indeed." He paused, his multifaceted eyes turning towards Dave. But not without a certain appeal. He looked back at the assembled Glargons. "My father," he declared, "had a deep appreciation for the unusual. He always encouraged exploration, not just of new territories, but of new ideas, new sensations." The Admiral's son straightened his posture, a new resolve in his voice. "Therefore," he announced, "in honor of Grand Admiral Krill and his insatiable curiosity, we will officially recognize this whiskey toasting as a sanctioned form of mourning." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The very idea was revolutionary, a complete overturning of centuries of tradition. But the Admiral's son had spoken, and in the face of such a pronouncement, even the most rigid Glargon knew better than to object. And just like that, Dave became something of a celebrity. The Glargons, a species not known for their spontaneity, had a new bizarre custom to explore. He was released, of course, with apologies that sounded suspiciously like sonar pings. The concept of whiskey, or at least the Glargon approximation of it, which involved fermented kelp and a hint of electric eel, spread like an oily slick throughout the underwater city. Humorous cultural exchanges blossomed, mostly involving Glargons grimacing after their first taste, followed by a strange, watery sigh of contentment. Imagine a Glargon karaoke night, fueled by lukewarm, slightly electrified kelp whiskey. It was a sight to behold. Dave mostly stayed out of it, content to observe the chaos he'd unleashed, a faint smirk playing on his lips. The episode concludes, naturally, with Captain Zorp. He stood rigidly at the edge of the main plaza, a small glass of the Glargon whiskey substitute clutched in one of his many tentacles. His multifaceted eyes darted nervously around, ensuring no one was watching too closely. He took a tentative sip. His bioluminescence flickered violently. He coughed, sputtered, and then, with a sigh that sounded remarkably like a deflating pufferfish, shook his head in bewildered amusement. "Humans," he muttered to himself, "utterly incomprehensible, and yet—" He took another sip,